as they say, Wrestlemania 20, where it all began again at Madison Square Garden. They had Wrestlemania 1 at MSG, they had 10 MSG, they had Wrestlemania 20 at MSG.
And they didn't have 25 or 30 at MSG.
No, they did not. That's true. They broke the tradition.
They outgrew MSG. I had really thought that they were going to go with 30 in MSG. I just thought it was like a given. And, they went to MetLife Stadium at 29, right?
Yeah, and 30 was New Orleans, yeah.
Yeah, so when they said MetLife Stadium at 29, it's like, wow, they're going to go to a stadium. And that Garden tradition, and they're probably right. There's more money to be made in the stadium. WrestleMania is now a stadium show. It's just what it is. Too many people want to get in. It would have been, you'd have to charge $500 a seat in the Garden and to make the money. And so, yeah, it's the right move. But I just with the tradition thing, thought they would do it again. But here, you did go from Safeco Field and 54,000 people to the Garden and 20,000 people.
Sure thing, yeah. And this was the last WrestleMania at MSG. Who knows? It may be the last one ever at MSG. And JP and I were there. We took it in, and I remember the closing scene of Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero hoisting championships in the air, confetti falling from the ceiling, and being overjoyed at the achievement for these two guys who were constantly swimming upstream in terms of their American pro wrestling careers, constantly having to shatter barriers. Yes, vanilla midgets.
The vanilla midgets. I tell you what, man, when we go back through these WrestleManias and all these flukes, you know what I mean? And there's so many of them. It's just so weird. The Austin Brett and just all of these freaking fluke things that happened at these shows that couldn't be planned and what they meant for our lives and things like that. And this was another one. I mean, who'd have ever thought when we watched this that these two guys would be dead in 3.5 years?
Yeah.
Or just over 3 years. They would both be dead. That Chris Benoit, who was probably, this is the thing. Chris Benoit was probably with the exception of The Undertaker, was probably by the wrestlers the single most respected guy. I mean, people now portray him as this monster because of what he did and what he did in that last week, and he was a monster, and that's it's something that I've never really fully come to grips with that even today. The whole Chris Benoit thing. I watched the Chris Jericho was interviewed Chavo Guerrero on his podcast several months ago, and he told me you do have to listen to this, and I listened to it and it was just like wow, it was the first time it's like wow, I really dealt with it because when the whole story was going on, I was just so buzzed with that story that I couldn't, and then I never wanted to deal with it. I've never watched another, since he died, I've never watched a Chris Benoit match, and the only thing I did was one time on one of the New Japan pay-per-views, they were promoting a DVD, I think it was a Jushin Liger DVD, and Jushin Liger's greatest career opponent was Chris Benoit. So unlike here where they've erased his life, there they haven't, and they showed during intermission of a show about 5 minutes of a Jushin Liger Chris Benoit match. This is probably 2 years ago, and I just remember watching, going like, I had completely blocked him out of my mind, and it was like, holy Toledo, this guy is like one of the greatest wrestlers I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I mean, he was, and if you'd asked me, I would go, of course he was. I would always say that, but it was so blocked from my mind that when I saw him again after, in 2012, after never watching him for 5 years, it just like hit me. Oh my God, he really was one of the greatest wrestlers that I've ever seen, and. On this night, this was the crowning achievement of his career. It probably was really the crowning achievement of Eddie Guerrero's career. He won the title the month before, but retaining it at WrestleMania in the Garden over Kurt Angle was bigger than backdooring with the Brock Lesnar loss that was really caused by Bill Goldberg in winning the title, although that was also a big night for him. I mean, this was their night, and Eddie died first, and I think if Eddie hadn't died, I don't know that. I don't think that Chris would have, but God, who the hell knows? Who the hell knows?
Well, you said you still struggle to come to grips with it, Dave. It won't happen. You're never going to come to grips with it. That's
not fully. And of course, it changed the business too because I mean, look, we don't get chair shots to the head. As far as the blood, maybe we wouldn't have the blood either way, but we would have chair shots to the head. Now, I believe we don't have what other things? We have steroid testing, as whatever it is. We would absolutely not have that if it wasn't for Eddie Guerrero dying. And it would have been wink wink steroid testing until Chris Benoit, because I mean everybody was still on it even though they were testing. But after Chris, being found with all those steroids when they were steroid testing, I mean you couldn't very well pretend, so you had to make it more serious. So I mean so many things about the business changed because of those two guys.
And while they
a lot of guys got chances that never would have gotten chances because of, I think Ray more than anyone, but those Eddie, more than Chris. Eddie was another, because Eddie was a lot smaller and Eddie really was a top guy. A lot of guys that never would have had an opportunity because both of them have gotten opportunities to be stars in this business they would have never even been signed for developmental, and they ended up being big time superstars on the main roster.
So Eddie passing in November 2005, Benoit and the whole situation in June of 2006. So they would be around. They would
2007.
Pardon me. Thank you, Dave. So they would make more WrestleMania appearances, but it strikes me as this moment being the one to address this here on The Lapsed Fan is pivotal parts of WWE history, though sad parts of WWE history. You mentioned when we talked in the WrestleMania 13 segment about Montreal, about Bret Hart, about the Vince McMahon fallout and the whole double cross, but you said that the Chris Benoit situation, the murder-suicide of his wife and his son, was by far the biggest thing you've ever covered. And
the biggest thing I will ever cover.
Why?
I don't think that we're going to have a main event, superstar pro wrestler kill his wife, his son, and himself. I don't think we'll ever see that again. Maybe we will, because look at the thing with the football players,
Mm-hmm.
and and I do believe that, I don't know that the concussions are the whole story, but I'm absolutely convinced they're a good part of the explanation. Maybe 100%. I don't know. But we've seen some, very, some of the behavior of a lot, not a lot, but several football players doing some, the suicides anyway. I mean, not so much, but some of them also harmed their families and stuff and just became different people. I certainly hope that there's never anything like this ever again.
Yeah.
I mean, there never was before. I mean, there've been wrestlers that committed some horrible crimes, but I can't come up with one that committed one this horrible.
Compare the emotions, if you could, for us, Dave, of covering the Chris Benoit situation and the Eddie Guerrero situation.
Well, Eddie was one that broke your heart, because Eddie died of all the things that, made him Eddie Guerrero. I mean, he working through pain, wanting to have a great physique, trying to compensate for his height by building up incredible amounts of muscle. All of those things put incredible stress on his heart. So Eddie Guerrero was a terrible tragedy of someone who, Dusty Rhodes said it best, who was dying to be a main eventer and succeeded. Chris Benoit, again, I don't think it would have happened without Eddie Guerrero. Chris Benoit went through that period where he lost, three of his best friends: Eddie Guerrero, Victor Marr, who was Black Cat in Japan, and Johnny Grunge, who was like his best friend in Atlanta, in a very short period of time. And then I think he was also really good friends with Ray Traylor, who passed away as well. And Chris was he couldn't come to grips with it. Not that, how that explained killing your wife and son, I don't know. But he just was, I don't even know what to say about Chris Benoit. I mean, it's just a weird thing because, I was never like what I would call friends with Chris Benoit, but he was always nice to me, and I knew him since he was 19, and he was always cooperative and helpful and this and that. He was always a nice guy to me, but no, I mean, it wasn't like I was close. But with Eddie, and I wasn't close with Eddie either. I knew him a little. I knew Eddie Guerrero a little bit. When WCW would come to town and I would go to the show, after the show, if I hung out there, they would both be very nice and talk to me. A lot of guys would avoid me, and those two guys, would always go out of their way to say hi and be nice and have a conversation. And, Eddie would always talk about, the newsletter and, things he read in the newsletter and, things like that. It was always a pretty pleasant deal. But with Eddie, it was just, the whole thing was just, I was just so sad. It's so sad. With Chris, it was sad for 3 hours. I was hysterical sad, like with Brian Pillman, that much, maybe more than Eddie. But it was funny because I felt that I don't know the Eddie thing was just so sad. Again, the whole thing. Eddie was going to be world champion again, and you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And not that that's a big deal, but Eddie was. Eddie. It was sad to me on Eddie because here's the deal. Eddie was one of the best wrestlers I've ever seen. Also, just like Chris. And Eddie's personality was shy, and his personality was there, but it wasn't all the way there. Okay, it just wasn't. And then he figured it out, and it was all the way there the last couple of years. And damn if, like, when his personality was there, his body turned on him. I mean, people will he could do it. It was like watching, Misawa or somebody at the end, or a Kobashi. It's like on the big show, they could still do it and make you think that they were still it, but night after night, no. His body was beaten up. He couldn't go anymore, other than the nights he really willed himself to go. And every now and then, he would. There were these great Eddie Guerrero matches till the end, but he was hurting bad. And then all the guys knew it. And I was, so I always was sad in the sense of, God, if this Eddie Guerrero who gets it and had this personality could have the body and the because the mind was all there, but physically do what the old Eddie Guerrero could do, just so many more great years. And I knew it was borrowed time because I knew his body was going down. His body was going down fast. Not death-wise, didn't expect that, of course, at all. But just all of the injuries, I knew they were coming to get him, and it was it was kind of sad because the other aspect of him was world championship level. So, that was the thing with him. Chris, very quickly when you figured out what happened, it was just, just a completely different thing. That was just like a 6-week period that I don't know. It was probably in many ways the worst 6 weeks of my life. Because I didn't live. I existed. I was 24/7, no sleep, trying to figure out everything changing, this and that. I went. It was hell. The Eddie thing was hell in one way. The Chris thing was hell for 6 straight weeks.
Dave, in regards to Benoit and Guerrero both being victorious on the night of WrestleMania 20, was there a long-term plan with the two guys on top?
I don't think so. I think that Chris, I really got the impression with Chris that they never believed in him. And they were doing it as because he was so well respected, and he did have a lot of momentum. You guys were in the building. I mean, people will say Chris Benoit wasn't over, blah, blah, blah. You were in the building that night. At that point in time, Chris Benoit was the most over guy in the building that I recall on that
That's
night.
who everyone wanted to win that match, no question.
They had me on my feet. I mean, I always liked Benoit, but I was never a huge fan. But I was on my feet screaming at the end of that triple threat match.
Right, and plus, even though I think people, there was also a kind of thing because it was there was almost a catharsis thing of him winning at the end of the Bret Hart being screwed by Shawn Michaels story. I felt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where he was, he wasn't really Brett's protege, but he came from Stampede Wrestling, and he was the next biggest star from Stampede Wrestling, so to speak. Owen had been dead for years, and it was, and Owen never got that win over Shawn Michaels that he was promised, and it was almost like, I don't know if anyone else saw it that way, but I saw it, the fact that it was tap out submission and things like that. I mean, I thought that played into the story, but the story was of both guys. The story of these two guys who had been best friends for years and years and years, starting on those Japan tours, going through WCW where they never got the fair break, going through WWE and having to build themselves up because they were not, even though they were really over on that night in Dallas when they came over, they had to go through their political bullshit, and rise above, which they did. And here it was, the biggest WrestleMania 20, one of the biggest shows of all time. I think, it was the second, at that time, it was the second biggest pay-per-view in wrestling history, the biggest being 17, as far as buy rate went. So, yeah, because their record was broken in 2005 with Batista and Triple H. So at the time, it was the second biggest of all time. So it's like these two guys who can't draw, and here they are, doing the second biggest of all time. At a time when wrestling wasn't hardly as popular as it was in 2001. So it was like there was a lot of, and they did have help. I mean, that was a stellar undercard. You had the Goldberg Lesnar match. You had The Rock and The Rock coming back with Foley. You had a lot of big stuff on that show. It wasn't just Benoit and Guerrero, but the Benoit match was the main event. And Benoit was Benoit's in there with Shawn Michaels, Mr. WrestleMania, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, and Triple H, big time superstar. And Chris Benoit was the star of that match in that building, watching that night, not the other two.
And you mentioned The Rock. He, of course, teams with Mick Foley to face Ric Flair, Batista, and Randy Orton, the Evolution team on this show, reuniting, if you will, of the Rock and Sock connection. And for The Rock, since we last spoke of him at WrestleMania 19, pinning Stone Cold Steve Austin, kind of riding off into the sunset at this point, kind of being phased out or phasing himself out of the business, though it came to a strange end. Dave, talk about how The Rock sort of would disappear and his contract would lapse and not be renewed, kind of without any kind of courtesy done, kind of like a slap in the face almost, after all the contributions we've charted him making and the moments he's created at WrestleMania. After this match here at 20, we wouldn't hear from him again until the John Cena match at WrestleMania 28 in terms of in-ring at Mania, and it didn't necessarily end well with him in the WWE.
I thought this was, I mean, not at the time it happened, but like if you say 2 years later, 3 years later, I would have said, okay, this is the last match of his career. It was on that night. I mean, on that night, it happened. I never thought it was the last match of his career or anything like that. He was still considering, he had ideas for 2005 WrestleMania. But then his contract expired, and they didn't renew his contract. And, no phone call, no nothing. The contract expired, and that was that. It was very weird. There was I think bitterness. Him and Vince I think he went to the WrestleMania the next year in LA, right?
Yep.
LA. Yeah, he went to him and Vince sat down in LA and they made amends. They were fine from that point on. But until then, it was a weird deal. I think it was a weird deal from both of them. Vince doesn't have acrimonious, or does have acrimonious splits with everyone who's on top at some point or another, and that was his time with Rock, to have the acrimonious split. I think Rock did things in the movie that Vince didn't like. The playing the gay character he thought was the wrong thing and harmful to the image of The Rock that he was trying to portray as a wrestler. And Vince, I remember going on one TV show and just ripping him for it, and I'm going like, God, that's so that's what I knew. It's like there's that thing there, but they made up. But yeah,